A really fun technique is to use adjustment layers. Adjustment layers are a feature brought from Photoshop into After Effects. They basically use a combination of transparency and effects to treat all the layers underneath the adjustment layer. Again, I have a project very similar to what we worked in the last chapter, a black solid with a mask, creating a darkening vignette around this girl. But rather than that black color, what I'm really interested in is this transparency. I'm going to solo it, hit the transparency switch. What this pattern shows me is the areas that will be affected and unaffected by any effects I apply to this adjustment layer. Turn the solo switch off. To make this into an adjustment layer, I need to open up the switches column. So I'm going to toggle switches modes, F4 is the shortcut. And see this little half moon icon? If you turn that switch on for any layer, it converts it into an adjustment layer. Initially, it'll seem like it has no effect. To see a change, you need to actually apply an effect to this adjustment layer. So let's try something like effect, radial blur is kind of fun in a situation like this. You see I got a bit of a spin going on around her. I'm going to click on center and center the radial blur on her nose and adjust the amount of blur around her or play around with the blur type, such as zoom, and pull that out. And go back to spin, something a bit more reasonable. So you see what's going on is just the parts of the adjustment layer that were opaque are affecting the underlying footage, and the parts of the layer that were transparent are unaffected, before and after. Just as with vignettes, the opacity of this layer on top controls the strength of the effect. There's unaffected, there's a partial blend, and there's a full blend. And if you wanted, you could even use blending modes. I'll toggle switches and modes again, and try some alternate modes such as add, which creates a really blown out look in this area around her. Or perhaps another mode such as overlay, which creates very intense colors around her, before and after. This basic technique of using an adjustment layer on top with an effect and a blending mode is a little trick we call filmic glow, and again we have a whole nother course on that. You don't need to stop at just one effect. You can apply an additional effects. I'm going to turn this back to normal for now so you can see what I'm doing, and apply a color correction effect such as hue saturation. Now I can take these blurred or adjusted areas, pull the saturation out of them to go back to a black and white look around her, or make them more saturated to create a more intense sort of look. Maybe something in that area. Hue saturation allows you to do hue shifting, or one of the little known qualities of it, it can also colorize the underlying footage. So in this case, I got a nice rosy tint around it. I can go to a different tint color behind her, more saturation or less. I'm actually going to go back to that sort of rosy tint, select my mask path, look at my mask shape, and again, pull this down to include more of her shirt so that that part's not affected, not adjusted. There we go. Turn that off. And now I've got a treatment where her face remains in focus and everything around her has been put out of focus and colorized. We're using the same idea of a masked black solid, which is what we used initially for our vignettes, but now we're pushing it further by using it to gate where effects are applied to the underlying footage. And speaking of effects, this works fine if you use mask, but it does not work if you've used paint. The reason is that paint itself is an effect, and turning on the adjustment layer switch for a paint layer will only cause it to try to paint the layers underneath. Not at all what you want.